I'd like to announce the speakers now. So, Éireann Leverett from Concinnity Risks is the co-author of Solving Cyber Risk and a cyber risk entrepreneur. Fun fact for everyone, his favorite programming language is OCaml, OCaml, for those who are doing the CTF, that might ring a bell. Scott Small is a security and intelligence practitioner, an expert in cyber threat intelligence and threat modeling. As well as many other things, he's currently the director of cyber threat intelligence at Tidal Cyber. So without a further ado, I'm going to hand it over to them and their talk on Ransomware Zugzwang and ransomware defense prioritization.
Thanks. So, Ransomware Zugzwang. Why Zugzwang? What a strange title. Any chess players in the audience? A few? You've heard of Zugzwang? That kind of position that you can end up in. We've got a slide for it. Oh, there it is. Awesome. You're such a cool guy to work with. So it's a position where you're fine as long as you don't move. And I just wanted to highlight that for ransomware gangs, they have this position. Essentially, if they ask for a ransom, we have some way of contacting them or finding them. So they're forced to move, and that gives us a hook to do a lot of the other cool things that we're going to do in this presentation. So that's it. Just think about that throughout this. What do ransomware actors have to do to get paid, and how can we use this to approach defenses and other things? So over to Scott.
Awesome. So ultimately, I see this as a data science presentation. We're trying to look at different ways of measuring the threat of ransomware across the landscape. So we're going to be doing that in a few different ways. So just some of the, I would say, highest level summary metrics, pulled this from a fantastic chain analysis report. Ultimately, depending on how you look at the landscape, you could have a different impression of whether the threat is going up, down, or kind of somewhere in between. And I think that's often where it lands. But just to run through the metrics on the right-hand side, according to this report and the data that they had available, many of the key ransomware metrics in 2022 were down. So the number of publicly claimed victims seems like positive news. Ransomware payments, according to how they're measuring it, very important, as well as the average ransomware lifespan measured in days of how active a group was. And that kind of leads into just some of the challenges right away of figuring out whether threats are going up or down. I think hearing that the lifespan might be shortened may at surface value seem like positive news, but in a lot of ways that can actually create challenges for keeping track of which groups are out there and how they're operating. Can be a serious challenge for defenders.
So like a shorter lifespan means faster time to collect indicators or TTPs. It increases the pace for CTI, right?
Absolutely, and we're going to circle back to looking at the TTPs kind of across the landscape and whether it is important or not to keep track of necessarily every single new group that's out there, or maybe looking at overlaps with existing ones as well.
Cool. It's a real honor to work with Scott. He's done a lot of really amazing CTI over the years. Like, as someone who's working with him at Tidal regularly, he's one of the hardest working guys I've ever met. There's many times in the last few days he's been up in his room finishing other things, not for this presentation, but for completely different stuff. So it was great to collaborate, and I do more of the financial statistics, economics stuff. I'm part of the Ransomware Special Interest Group, or I chair it, and I invite you to come along and share some of this stuff with us. This is a decade of ransoms plotted on a log plot. So the log plot is important because, you know, the things at the top of the plot are like 100 or 1,000 times higher than the things at the bottom. And the colors are different ransomware threat actors over time. So this is not ransomware incidents, this is ransomware payments, ransom payments. So we have 120,000 Bitcoin addresses that we've been tracking over nearly a decade, and that leads us to this kind of graph. So the first question we wanted to ask, are ransoms getting worse over time? Just ransoms, not necessarily ransomware events, because we want to make a lot of distinctions. And the correlation coefficient here says yes, unsurprisingly, which is an interesting story, right? Because I also know that less people are paying ransoms, but the ransoms they pay are larger. So that means we need to think about that as a kind of business model. So yeah, you can very scientifically say ransoms are getting worse over time. The good news is that we think only about 16% of people are paying which means that we can deal with ransomware incidents and handle the issue without necessarily just paying the ransoms. This is taken from a report that I did in collaboration with Trend Micro. We presented some of those results last year before we made the report. The report has been released. If you want to read it, it's like 100 pages long or something, filled with all kinds of details. So thanks to the Trend Micro team and Wartile Analytics for supporting all that. So only 16% of people are paying. I'd like to give you a little hope in ransomware, right? And in specific gangs, you can track that number, and it's different for different groups. So this is like an average of an average, the 16%. All right, another important thing here, focusing on the ransoms again for a moment. The correlation against the gang is really high. Like, if you're not a stats or an econ person, let me unpack that. You can see each of these is a ransomware threat actor at the bottom, and you can see the variance of the payments of their ransoms to each threat actor. And the thing I want you to take away from this graph is it's different. Different threat actors cost different amounts of money, both in terms of the ransom that they can demand, but also in terms of the loss or the damage that they do. Okay, and again, we've done a correlation coefficient to check this. It's not just an intuition, it is scientifically verifiable. Now, why is that important? Because looking at all ransomware threat actors under the same kind of economic lens is not the correct thing to do. You can get hit by a very small one and the incident isn't very expensive, or you can be hit by one of the big ones and it can still not be very expensive, or it can end up being really, really, really costly. So when we're thinking about these different threat actors, we need to keep in mind that they are different, and we need to think about that both in economic terms, but also in threat intel terms.
So clearly a lot of nuance that needs to be taken into account when looking at really any of these segments of the data. So I'm going to start to transition into a little bit of victimology now. And as I mentioned at the top, it kind of depends on how deep and granular you want to look at the data. So across the entire landscape, we saw, according to certain metrics, that many ransomware metrics were down in the past year. But that was the overall landscape approach. For certain sectors in particular, we're seeing almost certainly increasing levels of threats. And oftentimes these are coming to some of the most vulnerable sectors across society in general, and I've listed out a few of these, as well as very impactful ones. So things like utilities, of course. When we look at education threats, obviously a major concern to our society in general, we are almost undoubtedly seeing growing numbers of attacks, and some groups almost entirely specifically focused on attacking these sectors. Healthcare has been a major issue as well. This can, in some ways, lead to some positive developments for the defender community when we see a pretty clear shift in targeting, especially against very critical sectors like this. We oftentimes see an increase in reporting and improved cyber threat intelligence to allow us to address some of these threats. And this is definitely the case for some of the groups that have been most active in targeting these vulnerable sectors over the past year, year and a half or so. Just a real quick visual just to emphasize some of the specific, these are all public victims that have been either claimed or reported in news reporting across these especially important and vulnerable sectors. So education, healthcare, transport, and logistics, and especially local government administration. All right, so a lot to digest in this slide. We're really proud to share this one. This is some analysis that we initially conducted at the beginning of this year, looking at a much smaller sample set of data, and we've just kind of expanded the sample size here and enriched this. So what this data is based on is publicly claimed extortion victims, so these classic data leak sites. There are plenty of caveats to be talked about when looking at this data, but at the end of the day, I've mentioned a lot of this is really kind of a data science problem. I think the level of abstraction in looking at publicly claimed extortion victims kind of gives us a proper level of scope when we start talking about defenses and how those may change depending on the group that we're looking at. I think if it's not obvious here, I know there's a lot of colors in each of these wheels, but this is looking at the industry or sector breakdown of the victimology per major ransomware as a service group here. I think the major takeaway is that there's a lot going on here, and ultimately what that means is, in many ways, ransomware as a whole, or at least amongst these most active groups, is largely indiscriminate activity.
I wanted to highlight too that Scott told me this morning that the size of each of the pie charts on this graph is proportional to the number of victims they have. So you can see their sort of contribution collectively.
Yep, absolutely. So when we do start to drill down into certain of these groups, and I think this is especially relevant for the audience here, some of you all may be focused on particular sectors if you're part of a national CERT. I do see some value in trying to get into that granular level. So again, if we look at Vice Society and kind of the lower right-hand side, this is one of those groups that appears explicitly focused on attacking certain vulnerable sectors within society, and it's really unfortunate trend. But you can see a large portion of their graphic is made up of education-related victims. So you can kind of drill down and get that granular if you want to. What we're going to start to do and pivot towards some defensive recommendations is looking at kind of this class of threats as a whole, so ransomware as a whole, and specifically focusing in on the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures associated with them. So we'll drill down a little bit more into specific techniques associated with them in a few moments, but one thing I finally...
Yeah, before you move on, like I want to stay on this slide. I see a lot of these slides and they change over time. Like I'd really like to animate this over time because I think it might be changing slightly. But I kind of hate them because they're not very actionable, or at least that's my impression, right? Like if you're an enterprise, you're not going to change from being a financial business to being a non-financial business to avoid being, extorted. If you're a CERT, maybe this is more actionable, as Scott was highlighting. Maybe if you're a sectoral CERT, you can do some interventions or reach out. But then it's also complicated because some groups specifically target certain sectors and others don't. So really when we're analyzing this data, we have to take into account the number of companies in those sectors. Some of the stuff that plays out in the pie charts might be prey effect rather than predator effect. And so you have to do a lot of work to differentiate that. And that's why I think it's hard to make this actionable intel. But we've got a lot of other actionable stuff for you.
Yeah, for sure. And more updates to come on this. I'm excited to keep kind of just continuing to slice up this data and make it that much more granular. So as we continue to transition into talking about defensive recommendations, a real quick plug, what made our lives easier in starting to analyze a lot of this data, just to highlight, what this graphic is showing is the volume of publicly available MITRE ATT&CK mapped CTI reporting. The amount of data and reports that are mapping to MITRE ATT&CK kind of out of the box, coming with a nice neat table of attack TTPs at the bottom, is undoubtedly increasing. And just a quick plug, if you're not doing anything along those lines, maybe try to consider it. We can talk about good approaches to mapping reports. But it just, at the end of the day, it makes practitioners' lives easier. MITRE ATT&CK is a lingua franca, allows you to speak a common language when speaking about TTPs, and ultimately, as we'll show, start to pivot into some defensive recommendations as well.
It's really important that we're able to do that. I mean, I've been tracking CVEs for a long time, and making lists of which CVEs different ransomware threat actors use is a total pain, and then keeping it up to date. And more importantly, like, when do you delete them? Like, how do you know they've stopped using those techniques and they've moved on to other things? It's a real challenge. So I much prefer this kind of MITRE ATT&CK approach, and we'll share a lot more of that as we go forward in the graph. So this is a new data visualization for me. I've never done this one. I hope it sort of speaks to the audience. I gave you the simplest one first. This is called an upset plot. So this is the number of MITRE ATT&CK techniques that we have associated with these different groups that don't overlap, if you like. So this is all the stuff that one threat actor does that nobody else does. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that there's a large number of these techniques that only apply to a single threat actor. And this is across 20 active groups, not the sort of 140 that we know have ever existed, just the ones that we think are active today. And the takeaway for this is, should you really be defending against these things as an enterprise? Probably not. It's only going to protect you against one of these individual groups. Of course, if you have the budget, you should do it. But you should be ranking your threat actors in terms of your defenses. If you're not, you're kind of gambling with your security budget, which is not the way I like to see things go. So the next one I want to show you is more of the correlation plot. So we've identified these 5 or 6, actually we've got more like 10, but these 5 or 6 MITRE ATT&CK techniques are shared by at least 50% of the groups. So each one of these techniques is done by 50% of the threat actors, at least, if not more. And then more importantly, collectively, they cover all of the groups except for Ransom House. Now, of course, data encrypted for impact is going to be on the top. We're not allowed to talk about that. We're going to ignore that. That's ridiculous, because of course you knew that already before you even came to our talk. So let's focus on these others. file and directory discovery, system information discovery. If you've got protections for those, we heard about it in the previous talks. I loved the Chaos ransomware cracker talk. That was amazing. The ESI ransomware talk earlier was great. You saw a lot of file and directory discovery when Lindsay was up here talking about, you know, the techniques that were being used, right? Inhibit system recovery is pretty obvious. I think originally command and scripting interpreter, when we studied it, it was the sub technique, right? It was unsurprisingly PowerShell. But we feel we should say more about that because it's not just PowerShell. It could easily have been Apple shortcuts or something. It probably will be in the future. Anything else you want to say about these? I mean, you're going to deep dive on them in a moment and think about their detections and so on. But
yeah,
here?
Nothing else at this level. I really do love these upset charts, though. I think it does a great job of kind of showing the distribution as we keep talking about the pros versus cons of looking at individual specific actor groups. I think this is a great way of kind of visualizing that. Shifting gears just slightly, but while also taking a huge step back, what you're seeing now is very similar in a lot of ways to the data that Éireann just summarized for you. What we're seeing now is, so we did just this study of ransomware groups using the same ones that we included in our victimology analysis, but looking at the MITRE attack techniques associated with these. Many of these groups at the time we did the study, and some still are not currently tracked in the formal MITRE attack knowledge base. As we've mentioned, groups are popping up and dropping off all the time, so they don't have the bandwidth and resources. They don't set out to track every single one, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of public reporting that's coming out mapping to these techniques, and so we're trying to help kind of keep track of all that as it's going. But what you're seeing here is the rank ordered list. I know it's pretty small. I'll zoom in just a moment. But the rank ordered list of the MITRE attack techniques that were simply observed most often in the public reporting that we are looking at. So it's a data set of around like 100 CTI reports, government advisories, vendor blogs, independent blogs, things along those lines. So clearly there is a lot, even when we drill into we picked an arbitrary top 14, I think is this list, anything mentioned 13 times and above, whatever I could reasonably fit on the slide. How do you begin to prioritize in terms of defensive next steps, either protections, mitigations, or detections against these techniques? There are many different ways to go about doing that technique prioritization. Looking at some of the columns farther on the right-hand side of the slide, those are some of the other factors that can be used. What we do at Tidal, one of the first things we like to look at is, as Éireann mentioned, the technique versus sub-technique level. The sub-techniques are simply more granular versions of the techniques, and oftentimes that means you have more detail available about how to write a detection rule. That might seem pretty obvious to folks, but if you're not familiar with the knowledge base, that's some important structure there. The tactics as well. So as we noted, very clear front runner in the data set, data encrypted for impact is the top technique. Well, this is an impact technique. It's usually coming at the literal end of the kill chain. It is the last objective of the adversaries. Yes, some of that activity actually is detectable, but at that point, it's quite simply too late. So trying to potentially wait and rank order certain tactics, the easiest way, you know, obviously at the end of the day, you could argue they're all important, but looking at phases in the kill chain, which ones might be relatively more or less important? Are there choke points where you can have better ROI for detecting against some of these? Those are some inputs. And then as I start to transition into kind of the short list of some techniques that at a quick glance, I would probably recommend, especially for detection engineering efforts specifically. One of the other major factors that can be an input to prioritization is the amount of publicly available, or maybe if you're using commercial tools, analytics or detections that exist for certain techniques. So this is the second to last on the right-hand side column here.
A number of Sigma analytics. And just, you know, I know a lot of people understand Sigma probably much better than I do, but for those who are kind of new to it, like the value of the Sigma analytics is that they can be translated into whatever tooling you have. Like we're doing our best to make this universally applicable to you. Yeah, anything else you want to say about that? Like you know, it's not that you should implement all of these Sigma analytics, right?
Certainly. Yeah, and you can actually see this in one clear-cut case, so the case for PowerShell. If you drill in to this table here, PowerShell, towards the top of our technique list, you can actually see there are 183 Sigma analytics for this specific MITRE attack technique. There is a reason for that. This technique is used, it's talking about the use of PowerShell to conduct other things. So that's not to say that it's not important whatsoever, but you kind of have to really drill into that set of Sigma analytics. You're not going to want to go, it may sound obvious, but if you're not familiar, you're not going to want to go and turn on alerts for every single one of those analytics. You'll absolutely overwhelm your team, and it would be a counterproductive exercise, alert fatigue to the max, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of something that looks like this audience on a Friday. Alert fatigue is something we all have by the end of the conference, right? Sorry.
Nailed it.
It is a tough crowd. It's yeah. Anyways, the other thing I want to talk about was the timing of these different techniques and like where they show up in the flow. Because I was talking to you about this earlier, and I was making some stupid assumptions about like obviously that would come first, and you had some great points of like some of these techniques seem like they would come at the beginning or the end, but actually they could be both. Yeah. Any more thoughts about time?
Yeah, for sure. So we're hearing a lot of interest in, conversations with community members, our clients, about this idea of choke points. It's definitely coming up. The Center for Threat-Informed Defense, their attack flows projects, seeing a ton of interest in something like that. So that is using something like MITRE ATT&CK techniques, but also building out the actual flow, the chain of events of a given intrusion. I'm seeing a lot more. It's a slow start, but definitely starting to hit more critical mass, just mapping into that type of data structure. It's going to be super important when we start to do this analysis, overlaying various attack flows and see where the choke points are coming up. It's going to be really helpful. Yeah.
And the data components, just unpack that for the audience too, because they might not use the same terminology. What do you mean by data components? What's that column telling us?
Yep, so data components are talking about essentially the log sources that might exist within your environment that you can use to give yourself visibility or observability into these techniques. So as you can see, it does vary per MITRE ATT&CK technique. Oftentimes you may not be utilizing a certain log source because it could be incredibly noisy. That's another really important trade-off. Thank you for this reminder here. These discovery techniques, you're seeing a lot of these on here, and it's kind of easy for me to say, oh yeah, discovery, there's a lot of techniques here that you could take a look at. There's a reason. These are very challenging to detect with high fidelity. These are going to be really noisy activity as well, oftentimes benign activity that's just occurring as part of the normal course of business. The approach there is trying to, wherever possible, it's not always easy, but trying to find higher fidelity detections that you can use to recognize discovery techniques as they're being implemented. The major concept I see here in the community being discussed is this idea of correlation rules. And Sigma is actually building a new kind of structure into the project for correlation detections. It's going to look at the series of execution of multiple discovery techniques in a certain time frame, for example, and that's going to give you higher fidelity. It's more likely going to be malicious activity than just benign.
And there's an interesting tension here for everyone who's paying attention, that we want these techniques to be like super generalizable across other multiple ransomware threat actors, but we also want them to be like super specific for certain types of behavior on the machines, right? So that tension between generalizable and specific.
Cool. So just to transition out of this into the next, then last major section of our talk. So we've clearly benefited so much from public reporting and looking at the techniques here in an effort to share back with the community. We've added all of the techniques for all the ransomware groups that we've included in this study. Tidal has a freely available community edition, so just a super quick plug. Anyone can go out there and access these techniques. The big benefit here is that you can pivot immediately into things like those public Sigma analytics from those techniques to just make it ultimately that much more usable, operational for community defenders.
Perfect. There's another build on this slide, isn't there? I think.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, there you go.
So this, I'll cover this in 30 seconds. This is just a look at kind of that workflow that I've been talking about. So looking at top techniques, this is shifting gears a little bit. This is actually a different data set, but just for representative purposes, you look at a top technique, one that's shared by a bunch of groups in your study. You can clearly see that there's a few detection analytics available for this. What I've been doing a lot is actually looking at the mismatch between Sigma analytics that exist right now and something like Atomic Red Team tests, another public open source project. If you see a mismatch in there, it's oftentimes an opportunity to quickly write a new rule, and that's a workflow I've been doing and contributing back to the Sigma project as well. It's been working quite well, all driven around and based off of recent cyber threat intelligence.
Perfect. So a little bit of transition. Hopefully that was really actionable to anyone doing defense of ransomware. And I hope those techniques are super helpful to you. Now switching into kind of economics and the market generally. Obviously, some of the work we do in the ransomware SIG is trying to disrupt or deter or reduce various elements of ransomware, and that's complicated and not simple. This is my own personal little bugbear. We wrote a paper 2 or 3 years ago. Like, I get really nerdy and bored in Cambridge. There's not much to do in the evening, and so like I started studying ransoms, right? Obviously you do. And then once you've done that, you start to realize that these averages don't describe this data, and this might seem like a really, really petty point. But what I mean is the averages of these ransoms, the distribution is so extreme that the average doesn't characterize the middle, and I'll show you that in a visual way in a moment. And everybody still publishes like the average ransom payment was this. We want you to use the median. Fine, publish the average if you want to, but the average says more about the sub-data set that you have than it does about the actual characterization of the ransoms. It's not a good characterization of dynamics over time at the mathematical level. So I got so serious about that, I had to write a paper about it. Why does it matter? Like, why would I write an academic paper about such a thing? The graph on the left was what the ransomware market on a log scale had earned by the time we wrote the paper. And we were saying, look, if you pay attention to this and you fit a power law to this, you can see what the alpha of that power law is. And that parameter, when it changes, is sensitive enough to detect that it's going to get worse. And to prove that, I've put both of these on the same slide. So that's what we said before the paper on the let's see, your left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side is what happened after we wrote the paper. So please use those alphas instead of the averages to figure out that it's getting worse. It's important, it matters. Okay, next slide. All right, now again, if you're really interested in your maths and your extreme distributions, you can fit power laws or log normals to ransom data. What I mean by that is these are really extreme distributions, and to give you a sort of everyday characterization of that mathematics, the best way I can say is like, if we take Scott's salary and my salary and we average them, the average is like, you know, in the middle and it says something about our salaries. But if we add like Warren Buffett and Elon Musk into our group and we average, the average is not going to say anything about me and Scott's salary, definitely. And it's still not going to say anything about theirs because we're all dragging each other up and down with the average. And that's what's happening in these graphs. So you can fit power laws and log normals to this stuff, but you shouldn't. And that goes back to what I said to you earlier. Next slide, maybe. The reason you shouldn't do that is because these groups have very, very different distributions of loss. They even have different distributions of the frequency at which they operate. Remember the graphs that Scott was showing you earlier about victimization? You could see like Lockbit has more victims than, you know, Ransom House or whatever, right? So there's a huge difference. Now the heat maps I'm showing you here are a bit nerdy, a bit data viz, but there's a point to them. So the brightly colored one on the left is the actual distribution. So it's the Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance. Everybody in here does like, well, maybe not everyone, but lots of you do binary analysis. And we have distance metrics from this binary to this binary. This is basically, the KS distance is the same. It's a distance metric between this distribution and this distribution. And it says they're different, right? And then the graph on the right is the probability. It's the p-value. Now you would expect sort of 5% of these at the 5% p-value level to be sort of differing, but collectively they're saying if it's black, it's definitely not the same distribution. If it's white, it's probably the exact same distribution because it's being compared against itself. And everything that's like purple or orange might be similar. Now there's a lot to take away from this. One, not all the gangs are the same distribution, clearly. Don't fit a single distribution of loss to this. But also, we can use these statistical techniques to tell when it's the same threat actor that has changed their brand. And I think that's super cool. So, all right. Remember earlier I said 92% of ransoms are below average. I wanted to show you that in a single slide and make it clear. So this is still on a log scale. So again, it's like really distorted. If I did this on a regular scale, it's hard to fit into a single graphic. But the line would be much, much higher up the graph. So, you know, this is why I'm saying don't use averages to describe this stuff, because most of the ransoms are smaller. And when you publish this stuff, it scares people. They really think like, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to handle a ransomware incident. And then they panic and they don't do anything. And we want them to do things. We want them to install defenses, right? All right. Also actionable intel at the level of the work that we do. There is a peak ransomware payment season. It is next month. So prepare yourself, rest, relax, spend some time here, and then get ready to hit peak ransomware season. Then you can rest again in August. I don't know if hackers like go to Black Hat and DEF CON or something, but something happens in August, and there are less of them. This is only 3 or 4 years of data overlaid, but it's 95% confidence intervals. So the peak at the top is, you know, the 95 and the 5%, and that white line through the middle is the kind of mean of the number of ransoms that you're going to see paid at different times. So, okay, take your rest. Last thing, financial surveillance. So the left-hand graph is the age from first to last ransom for particular Bitcoin addresses. And you can see some groups, they really use the same infrastructure for years. Absolutely years. It's ridiculous. You still see payments to WannaCry like years afterwards. God knows why, but it happens. A lot of the short, you know, red lollipops on that graph, those are newer gangs that are recycling their Bitcoin addresses much, much faster. And the graph on the right is one specific campaign, Deadbolt. Deadbolt was a NAS locker, and essentially we were really lucky that we had a different Bitcoin address for every victim, and we had a different IP address for every victim, and it was public facing. So we could literally look and see how long do most people take to pay ransoms. And the reason I show you this graph, you'll see, one, it only goes down to about 10%. 10% for this particular gang was all of the people who ever paid, and that was only $3,000 for those ransoms. But the second thing I want you to see is that most of the people who paid really, really fast. They paid within 21 days, although there are some people who paid 200-something days out. But the point is, if you want to start blocking Bitcoin addresses and trying to stop ransomware that way, you have to communicate those addresses super, super fast in under 21 days to be able to shut it down. So I don't think that's the right approach. All right, moving on, finishing up.
We're at time.
All right, this is the index. This is, again, a sort of weird, cool thing, but the HHI index is a measurement of how much of a monopoly or a free market something is. And so you can see quarterly it changing since 2014. And it's my opinion that basically when we take down one of the biggest threat actors who's a monopoly, we go back into free market innovation mode, and then a new attacker emerges who's a monopoly again, and this is a way of measuring that. So the graph on the left was produced with my data, but the graph on the bottom actually comes from Scott and is a slightly different story about Hive, so I'll let you finish it off.
Yep, so more to come on this. We're going to overlay and try to take a similar look to what we're doing in the lower right and overlay that on the left-hand side. But essentially what we saw, my expectation when we saw the takedown of Hive was that there might be even just a brief lull period, less extortion posts, you know, everyone trying to lay low a little bit, not draw too much attention to themselves.
Like a chilling effect on the other gangs.
Exactly,
right.
Yeah. In fact, we actually saw the opposite. It wasn't a major increase, but if anything, we saw more extortion posts in the few weeks after Hive's takedown than we were seeing actually in the time period before, even including the ones that Hive was making. So more to come there, but clearly didn't see that chilling effect taking place whatsoever. It's going to be interesting to kind of overlay those as we see more takedowns on top of a graphic like Aaron's created on the left-hand side here. But I know we ate up a lot of our time, but thank you everyone. We got on a roll as usual, but appreciate the attendance. Yeah.
Really appreciate you coming along.
I think we can squeeze one question in if anyone's got one. Yep, go for it, Alex.
Uh-oh.
Awesome work. I love it. I just have one question regarding the compilations of techniques that you basically did. How do you evaluate the error rates of analysts assigning wrong techniques or incorrect techniques in the different cases that they have seen? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I think there's a difference between analysts, you know, maybe misassigning a particular technique to one group as opposed to many groups. And so we try and kind of tackle it in that way. Like you could view that one graph of like it only applies to one group as like reducing that risk. If it applies to many groups and it came from many analysts, then we're more confident that it's, you know, genuine. One of the problems we do have is that like the number of analytics like always, or sorry, techniques always goes up, and we'd love to have a better way of removing them at some point in time.
Yeah, I basically try to look at, don't have a formal system in place for it, trying to collect as much information as possible, but I think as we start to get more granular details, some of that's kind of the focus as well. So maybe not quite to the level of procedures, but definitely the sub-techniques, just to help us further filter as we continue to see the knowledge base only continue to expand.
Cool. Thanks very much, and watch out for alert fatigue.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Scott and Éireann.